Open your Bible with me to the book of Revelation. Book of Revelation will be there in a minute or 10. We have been studying and starting to study the subject, God's house. The end goal is to look at the Lord's New Testament kind of a church. I want, like some illustrations that will come to your mind, if you do something over and over and over and over, and it becomes second nature, and you get that muscle memory to do something, even if you've set it aside for a long time, and you go to do it again. And even I've had the experience where I'm obviously older and maybe not as strong as I was, and yet through muscle memory to be able to do some things that you've just done over and over and over. The reason I bring that up is that I want to lay the groundwork through this introductory part of the series to get into your minds that the Lord's house is a place. I want that to be muscle memory in the sense of illustration. That when you see a reference to the Lord's house, I want you to immediately think it's a place. When you see a reference to the Lord's church, which is the house of God, I want you to immediately see and think he's talking about a place. I want that to become second nature, because it is. In the Word of God, God's house is a place. It's not universal, it's not invisible, it's a place. And so I've spent the last 2 weeks looking at Bethel, the tabernacle, and the temple. And they all have that in common. They were a specific place. Now the tabernacle was mobile, which fit the need of the hour, but it was a place. Nothing universal, nothing invisible about it. And last week, we looked at, and I started with, and we didn't stay there, but we looked at Genesis 35, where God told Jacob to go back to Bethel, a place where he got encouragement and instruction, a place where Jacob resided when God helped him when he was worried about Esau. It was a place that he set up a monument. It was a place that he could go to. It was a place that we saw was a place of comfort. God comforted him there. God instructed him there. It was a place where he was encouraged. It was a place where he got refocused. His priorities can be reshifted because he's refocused, because he's at this place that reminds him of God. He's at this place that God spoke to him and was encouraging to him. He's at this place where he was told to clean up and put on your best and make this place sacred and special. It was a place that he was encouraged to set aside false gods, because you're here to serve the true and living God. And all of that was at a place. It was a place where that because of the setting up of the monument, it was obvious you could go back to it and go back to that place and remember that place where God spoke to me. That place that was set apart and sanctified for God's service. And that was Bethel, which means the house of God, a place. And then God in Exodus 25, well after Bethel, told Moses, build me a place called a tabernacle. Here's the instructions. Moses built that place. When it was completed, some 15 chapters later in the book of Exodus, chapter 40, they dedicated that place. And the Shekinah glory of God filled it to demonstrate His approval of it and His indwelling it. And in the process of time, David prepared the materials and Solomon built a new and more permanent place, the temple. And when it was built according to specifications and God's instructions, God did the same thing with His Shekinah glory and indwelt it. And the temple was the house of God. And there was nothing universal and invisible about the temple. David wrote songs about it. They inquired of the Lord in it. The priest did his work there. It was the place where God would meet with His people. And that's the pattern of God throughout the 4,000 years of Old Testament history. God met with His people at a place. Sometimes a tent, but it was the place God said, that's where I'll meet. Sometimes a more ornate temple. And that was the place where God said, I will meet. And so we spent that time building those muscle memory thought processes. House of God, place. Worship God in a corporate manner, place. Come together and sing praises to God, place. David writing so many of the Psalms to be the hymn book of the temple, place. And then nowadays, you come into the New Testament and you say church, and 99% of the people say universal, invisible. Not a place. Something's wrong with that. So I want to connect what we've been studying and the pattern of God, the well-established pattern of God of meeting with His people at a specific place. I want to take that pattern into the New Testament. And this is an approach to the study of the New Testament church that I've never done before. And I don't know that I've ever heard it before. But I think it's vital. That takes us to Revelation chapter 1. After having reviewed God's working with Jacob at Bethel, Jacob calling that place house of God, and the tabernacle, the temple. And this God-established pattern, notice what John sees in the book of Revelation, starting in the first chapter, in the 10th verse. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet, saying, I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. And what thou seest write in a book, and send it unto the 7 churches. Place, or in this case, places, the 7 churches. Send it to the 7 churches which are in Asia, unto Ephesus, unto Smyrna, unto Pergamos, unto Thyatira, unto Sardis, unto Philadelphia, unto Laodicea. And I turned to see the voice that spake with me, and being turned, I saw 7 golden candlesticks. And in the midst of the 7 candlesticks was like unto the Son of Man. We'll stop our reading there and focus on what we've read thus far. Now, the 7 candlesticks represent the 7 churches. We see this made clear to us in verse 20. He's unraveling a couple of different things, but the mystery of the 7 stars which thou sawest in my right hand and the 7 golden candlesticks. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches. And the 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the 7 churches. You see, you remember back in Matthew chapter 5 that the Lord said, nobody lights a light and puts it under a bushel. Nobody lights a candle in their day and puts it under a bushel, but they light the candle and they put it on a candlestick. And He's giving us the picture of that is what He's using to illustrate His church. In this case, His church is places. I want that to be second nature. Worship God corporately, place. Sing to God corporately, place. Hear from God corporately, place. The Lord's New Testament church, place. Or places. Specific and literal places where people, which is the only kind of worship you can do, corporate worship you can do, where people meet together. And what's the candlestick? It's identified to us in verse 20. Churches. 7 candlesticks, 7 churches. You read the letters to the 7 churches, places, and all the places are identified, so they're very literal. There was a church in Ephesus, there was a church in Smyrna, there was a church in Pergamos, the church in Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. Each of those cities had a church located there. Boom! A place. And in the midst of them, what do we see in verse 13? In the midst of the 7 candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man, the dwelling place of God. He's in their midst. Jacob back in Bethel said, I'm putting a rock here. I'm putting a series of rocks here. I'm putting a memorial here. God was in this place. I didn't know it. This place is where God dwells. And I want to remember this place. So he set up a memorial. I want to know where God dwells. And in the Word of God, what you see develop as a pattern of God is that it's always a place. When you're talking corporately, when you're talking about serving Him as a congregation, you're talking about serving Him as a group of people in a given location, it's always a place. And who's there? Well, Matthew 18:20, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name. Now that means a lot. To be gathered together in His name is to be gathered together under His authority, by His direction. To be gathered together in His name are not 2 people standing on the corner that both say they love Jesus. That's wonderful to have 2 people standing on the corner that both say they love Jesus. That's not gathered together in His name. In all of Matthew 18, down through there, he's talking in church context. Because he's talking about solving problems within the congregation. And when the two brethren in the illustration that the Lord gives in Matthew 18 can't solve their problem, he said, tell the problem to the church. Boom! Place. Can you tell the problem to a universal, invisible group of people? Well, you maybe could if you could find them. But they're universal and they're invisible. Which is what most people say a church is. Now I know they'll say there's a visible manifestation of the invisible church. No such thing. Because the Lord's church is, and the Lord's pattern is a specific place, and the Lord's New Testament churches are located in specific places. They are literal manifestations of God's working with them individually, but not of the universal church, because it doesn't exist. And so in Matthew 18:20, where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I. Oh, we have a congregation of people, big or small, gathered under His authority, gathering by His direction, gathering per His instruction. That sounds like a church at a place. So I wanted to take those things that we've developed as a pattern of God, a place of memorial, a place of permanence, a place to be encouraged, a place to worship Him together, a place to get instruction, and take those and move those into the New Testament. So it would be a place that follows the pattern. And again, I'm emphasizing that ad nauseum, I'm sure. A place established by God. A place that fits the pattern of God and His working down through the last 4,000 years. He's not going to blow up the pattern to come into the New Testament times. A place started by God's direction. Remember that we read in Genesis 35 that God instructed Jacob to go back to that place. God was the one that drew that place to Jacob's mind in Genesis 35. A place that was started at God's direction. In Exodus chapter 25, God told Moses to build the tabernacle and build it according to the pattern. A place established by God's direction. You don't get any more clear than the Lord saying during His earthly ministry, upon this rock I will build my place, my church, my congregation. And I don't know that I want to make overly much of this, but I brought it up before. It comes to my mind again. The Father had His special relationship with Israel. The Son's going to have His special relationship with His bride, which is primarily a Gentile bride. I'm building my place, my church, my assembly. And that fits the pattern. The New Testament church fits the established way that God works. It has to be started by God's direction. New Testament church, rightly defined, is a place started by God's authority. Matthew 28. The tabernacle was not the brainchild of Moses. Bethel was not the brainchild of Jacob. The temple wasn't the brainchild of Solomon and David. God was in the midst of all those instructions. God was the one calling the shots. It was by God's authority that Moses leveled the taxes and did all that he had to do to raise the funds and put all the craftsmen to work. It was all done by God's direction. None of this, as it relates to the house of God, was the brainchild and culmination of the work of private individuals. Neither is the New Testament church. Nowadays, ABC Ministries or John Doe, Jane Doe Ministries put a sign in the corner on the roadside and say, "We've got us a church." Not according to the Bible definition. Not according to the well-established pattern of God. It takes authority. It's a place started by at God's direction. The Son of God said, "I'm going to build one of my own." And He did it. He started it. And He's continuing to build it as it pleases Him. It's a place started by God's authority. Matthew 28 and verse 18. Who's He got there? Verse 16, the disciples. Why are they there? He's talking to them in church capacity. He's giving them the church commission. He's telling them, He's going to tell them, to baptize. Who do you have baptize people? Churches. Baptism is a church ordinance, not a personal or private ordinance. So He's got the disciples here who have been named apostles in 11 because Judas is gone, but at this point, but He's got them there instructing them, and He tells them in verse 18, all power, and that word in the Greek is authority. Exousia. All power is given unto me in heaven and earth. Go ye therefore, I'm sending you in church capacity. Everything that He tells them is in church capacity. Evangelize, baptize, and catechize. Teach them, indoctrinate them in a good meaning, in a good way of understanding that word. Teach them the things of God. So it's a place started by God's authority. Just like Bethel. Jacob, go back to Bethel. Moses, build me a house. A place established by God's authority. A place directed and ordered by God. In other words, the function of it, how it operates, is ordered by God. Moses, he said in chapter 25 of Exodus, build it according to the pattern. I don't want this to be your brainchild. I don't want this to be the fruit of your efforts and the fruit of your thought processes. You couldn't come close to painting the pictures I want to paint. When you consider the furniture of the tabernacle and the temple, and the design and the layout of the tabernacle and the temple, and the function of the priests of the tabernacle and the temple, and the mercy seat and the Ark of the Covenant, and you consider all of the parts and pieces, and that in some way, shape, or form, everything pictures Christ. Moses, I don't want this to be your brainchild. You don't have enough brain cells. This has got to be my design. This has got to be my end result because I'm picturing Christ. And so the New Testament church has to be a place that is directed and ordered by God. He gives it the marching orders. He tells it how it's to function, how it's to be organized, how it's to operate. And what's its marching orders? Go ye therefore. So we're to be going. The Lord's churches are to be going. They're to be teaching all nations, and that idea is teaching them Christ, evangelizing, and baptizing them, obviously in church function, when you're talking about baptizing them, and do that in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And a further commission to the church is to teach them to observe all things. Propagate the truth from generation to generation, because I'm planning on this thing being around a while, because lo, I am with you to the end of the age. Lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. And so what we've been mentioning all along with this Bethel and the tabernacle and the temple, that it was a place of relative permanence. Not eternal permanence, but generational permanence. Where do you serve the Lord? Where God is. Where do you commune with God? Where He dwells. Where does the priest work? Where God receives offerings. Where does David write songs? And where are those songs congregationally sung? Where God's presence is. How does it operate? The way God tells us to. The Lord's New Testament church has to fit that standard. Directed by God, ordered by God, implemented by God, put into place by God. And again, I already mentioned it, that place of permanence, that place of generational permanence, a consistency, such as a church that's been in existence. And we start new churches, but the intent is to be that this generation raises up another generation, raises up another generation, raises up another generation. And there's a generational permanence there. There's a consistency there. There needs to be a consistency here, and there is. Sunday mornings, the parking lot begins to fill up, and the few neighbors and the couple of horses that are around here see, oh, it must be Sunday morning. The Faith Missionary Baptist Church is starting to gather together. It's Sunday morning. That's what they do. It's Wednesday afternoon. That's what they do. That's right. A place of consistency and permanence. It's the New Testament, what we've described. I'm sorry, I keep thinking in my mind to back up. Bethel was a place where God was honored. Jacob set up a memorial. I want to honor God here. I want to remember this place. Come back and remember what He did. And give honor to Him. It's a place where God was honored, glorified. The tabernacle was a place they could come together. The temple was a place they could come together and in a sense, in a way, honor God. Unto Him be glory in the church. Ephesians 3:21. The New Testament church is that fulfillment of that exact pattern that the Lord has implemented, where there's a specific place. Not a universal, invisible, can't find it kind of thing. But unto Him be glory in the church. A specific place. A place that encourages purity and faithfulness. Remember, there were things that Jacob was supposed to do to prepare to meet God at Bethel, including the washing of his clothes and putting on clean garments. There were specific things that he was encouraged to do. Put away his idols. That Bethel was then a place that encouraged participants in morality and purity and redefining of priorities and allegiances. And you read first the letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. A letter that Paul wrote that he addresses to the church which is at Corinth. That letter that is a list of addressing problems. That letter that is in chapter 5 very blunt about, look, there's sin in the church. There's sin in the church that it's a sin so grievous that a man should have his father's wife. that it's not even, this is not an immorality that even the Gentiles will participate in. And Paul said to the Corinthian church in chapter 5, y'all are involved in this and you're tolerating it. And he said you need to get rid of it. And he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 that it needs to be purged. And he describes what we would then call church discipline. And again, the church is a place that encourages purity, morality, encourages its participants to set aside immorality and impurity. And while you're on it, we talked about I read you a psalm where that the house of God in David's day, the temple, David wrote a psalm, I think it was Psalm 74, where he talked about the name, the dwelling place of thy name is being cast down. And David equated the reputation of God, that's the dwelling place of God's name, with his house. I mean, if the house is being looted and ransacked and demolished to such an extent that his name is being cast down to the ground, the reputation of God is obviously in the esteem of those onlooking. He's not much of a God. He can't keep the doors of his house open, can't keep his house under control. And so the dwelling place of God's name was in this place. And David wrote about it in Psalm 74. And as I quoted some of 1 Corinthians 5, it's early on in 1 Corinthians 5, might even be the first verse, where Paul begins to address this immorality that's taking place. And it's an immorality that he says, and it's quoted something like this, that not even, this immorality is not even named among the Gentiles. The Gentile who was considered the one so far from God, because the Gentiles, they were not raised on the Word of God. The Gentiles were not, by and large, people of Old Testament knowledge and history and understanding. So the only light they had was the light of, generally speaking, the only light they had was the light of creation and the light of their conscience. But they didn't revel in the moral law, and they didn't revel in the Ten Commandments and study what Moses had to say, and so on and so on. And so to say that this sin that's going on in your place, Corinthian church, this sin that's going on that's so bad, it's not even named among the Gentiles. And so you can see Paul making a reference to the dwelling place of God's name in the city of Corinth as that church. And the dwelling place of God's name was not upholding his name very well. And he tells them to take care of that and exercise church discipline. It's a place, as we've mentioned, that encourages faithfulness and purity, a place that is a place of unique and intimate relationship with God. The design of God is this. Men have perverted it terribly. But the design of God is that there's no more intimate relationship on planet Earth than between of a man and a woman that are married, with one more caveat, to each other. There's no more intimate of a relationship than a man and a woman living in holy matrimony together. The most intimate relationship on planet Earth. And in Ephesians chapter 5, almost the whole last half of Ephesians chapter 5, he gives those famous instructions that are always quoted at weddings because it deals with the intimate relationship between a man and a woman, and it deals with the order that God has placed in the home and the headship of the man and the woman meet for that serving him, and all of that's there. And in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 32, he gets to the point where he's done illustrating the husband and wife relationship, and he says, what I've been describing this whole time is the relationship of Christ and his church. Ephesians 5:32. Christ and his church. It's a place of intimate relationship between God and his people. So intimate that Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11 to the church at Corinth, I've espoused you to one husband. And I'm worried it looks like you may be becoming unfaithful. That you may have lost the simplicity or the singleness, the singularity that you should have for your groom. And it's a place that has this unique and intimate union with God. You can have a personal relationship with God. And that personal relationship with God can be enjoyed and celebrated and tapped into, if you will, anywhere the individual is. But in a congregational sense, in a corporate sense, there needs to be a special union between people and God. Between a congregation of people singing praises to God, worshiping God, ascribing unto him glory in a given place. Nothing, I want to use the word magical, I'm not sure I do. Nothing magical about these four walls. And yet, at the same time, it's normal studs, normal insulation, normal drywall, normal paint, normal light fixtures, normal carpet. There's nothing magical about any of it, but yet, at the same time, in this place, there's a special relationship that God has with his people. A place of permanence, a place of reverence, a place of comfort, a place of encouragement, a place that we sing glorious praise to him, a place that we hear from him, a place where God expects that assembly to continue. And he tells us in Hebrews chapter 10 that in very plain terms, that this needs to be a place of congregational assembly. Verse 24 and 25, let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works. A place where we gather together regularly to encourage one another, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, being cheerleaders one for another, and exhorting one another so much the more as you see the day approaching, as you see it getting darker and darker, you encourage one another more and more. Keep on keeping on. Keep on keeping on. And all of that takes place in a given location. with a specific address, as a congregation of people gathered together. A place where God speaks with his people. That's what Jacob was told early on. Go back to that place where I spoke to you. And Jacob is taken with that. I'm going back to Bethel where God spoke to me, where God manifested himself. He's going back to a place. And what does Paul tell Timothy, the preacher? And a lot of the preaching he does is done in churches. What does he tell Timothy to do? Preach the word. Be instant in season and out of season. So again, God's house is a place where his word is taught. So maybe I can convince you that God's house is a place, not a universal, invisible nothingness that nobody can lay their hand on, nobody can find. Maybe I can convince you that God's house is a place, and you still say, but where? But what kind? What's it look like? Well, we still have and continue to have the same pattern that we've had down through the establishment of earlier houses. When the tabernacle was built, according to the pattern, the Spirit of God indwelt it. And God, with a special presence of his Spirit, said, this is my place. And when the temple was built, and it was dedicated, it was built according to the pattern, and dedicated by Solomon, and God's Spirit indwelt it, and said, this is my house. And when Jesus said, I'll build my church, John prepared the materials. We studied that a little bit on Wednesday evening, and Jesus began to organize his first church. We get to Acts chapter 1, and we find that there's 120 people that have stuck together. And Luke tells us in chapter 1, I think it's verse 20, that there's roughly 120 people in that first assembly. And then in Acts chapter 2, the special presence of the Spirit of God comes upon them, very similarly to what took place with the temple and the tabernacle. And the very special presence of God comes upon them. We call it the day of Pentecost. And we say, wow, God has marked his approval upon that place. God has marked his approval. Look at them manifesting the evidence of the Spirit. Now, it's not exactly the same demonstration of the Spirit, but it is a demonstration of the Spirit for the same reason. To authenticate his place there in Jerusalem. To accredit them in the eyes of people. And to show this is my current place. And from the Jerusalem church, you can begin to see churches established. And I say from the Jerusalem church because it's a very clear pattern many, many times. Churches started from the church in Jerusalem. That's a different message for a different time. So we're talking about, whenever I say church, I want you to immediately say in your mind, from muscle memory, a place. He's talking about a church. He's talking about a place. Or places. Now I know, and we'll get into this as this study unfolds, there are a very few references in the Scriptures that talks about the Lord's church as an institution. Talking about the Lord's church generically as an institution. Like we would say Walmart in general, or Now I probably would say Amazon in general. And not talking about any specific hub or branch, but just in general. I like to shop at this or that. And we talk about it in the sense of an institution. But if I say I'm going to a specific store, I'm going to a place. And that's what I'm usually talking about when I'm talking about a church. That's the New Testament word church is far and away used in that sense. Out of the 115 times it's used in the New Testament, 3 times the same word is used and translated assembly in Acts. In that, where it's translated an assembly in Acts, it's obviously a given bunch of people in a given place. And so out of the 115 times that it's translated church, 36 of them are translated churches plural, so that's obviously given places, churches of Asia, churches of the region of Galatia or something, and that's obvious. And when you start boiling it down, there's half a dozen references that are probably what we would call in the institutional sense. But I want that muscle memory to be church place, a specific location of a group of people gathered together under the authority of God to operate the way He directs and to sing praises to Him as the Spirit leads. And then when you get to that point and you come to the New Testament and you read the word church, it'll start to clear up. There won't be the fogginess that unfortunately is around it now because of people misdefining the word so prevalently. And so we're getting into now more and more the meat of where we've been trying to head for the last several weeks. Although next week, Lord willing, we won't be gathered around this subject because our dear brother Bowen will be preaching for us. Let's stand.